I'm really in the thick of all of this stuff. I guess most of us feel like this. You know, we're sort of post-pandemic, but are we? We're not sure. Everything's changed, but has it? There's a brave new future, but also it's sort of the same. And so this talk is, you're going to be watching me kind of move through some thinking, which I'm right in the middle of. So it might not be super crisp in that sense, but it's going to be super honest, and I hope in that way it will be really, really useful. Just to explain very briefly my institution. So the University of Arts London is Europe's and possibly the world's largest art and design focused higher education institution. It's made up of a bunch of colleges. And you'll probably have heard of the college, of some of the colleges, even if you haven't heard of the university. And we've also got institutes, including a relatively new one, the Creative Computing Institute, which is, I think, is the first time we'll ever have done a sit-down exam, because they've got a computer science BSc in creative computing. So, you know, it's basically 20-something thousand students on courses where there isn't a right answer to anything. So it creates really interesting situations in terms of, you know, the mode of teaching, what it meant when we went online, assessment, the idea of belonging in community, you know, vulnerability and risk. As with all higher education students, but probably writ large, our students are constantly putting themselves on the line, because they're often saying, I've had this idea, I've created this thing, what does everybody think about it? So it's a really interesting environment. And we got a new vice chancellor, as if we went out to Boots and just bought a new vice chancellor. James has been at our place for about a year now, and is very interested in widening access to UAL to new communities of students. So, you know, it's quite interesting. We turn away more students than Oxford, apparently, to our residential programs. So we're really looking at online strategically as a mode that will allow us to invite more students to engage with UAL. We don't want to be known for turning people away. We want to be known for accepting people. So that's quite, you know, and I'm very much part of that strategic initiative, and it's good to have that wrapped around it. So that's the context I'm coming from and that I'm going to share. Now, the next slide sums up the entire nature of the pandemic in terms of education. In one slide is this shift. I do like this one. And what's interesting about that is, other than it's a bit silly, is this sort of concept that teaching is what happens when somebody's talking, like I'm doing now, and that everything else isn't teaching. Now, if you're a learning designer, clearly you don't think that way. A lot of people don't think that way, but a lot of people still think that way. And we're bumping into that around my institution, where there's a little bit of this sort of, well, you know, the design of my courses, I talk to the students and then they go away and do things, and then they come back and I talk to them some more, and then they go away and do some more things. Okay. But I think we're now moving into an era where that doesn't work anymore. So just to actually reference the title of the talk, I don't know why, but because I knew that this was probably not great for copyright, I took this picture of Fleetwood Mac and just mashed it up. Now, whether that makes it worse or better for copyright, I don't know. I don't think it matters too much. Fair use, let's say. You know, I think that what's happened is, over the pandemic, is that we have provided actually more ways that students can engage and more ways that they can disengage, and given students more choice for how they relate to us and how they choose to learn or choose to distance themselves than when we were predominantly residential. And so this is my slightly trite way of thinking about this, was that you can't put the flexibility toothpaste back in the tube post-pandemic. students have seen, you know, our emergency response was often actually very flexible and adaptable. It was fantastic. It was based on a lot of people working really, really hard, way beyond, you know, way beyond the norm, what anybody was contracted to do to hold everything together, but in ways that were potentially often more flexible than before. I mean, obviously there was a period where we just kind of flipped online, and if Tuesday afternoons was when you did 3 hours of teaching in a building, then you just did 3 hours of Zoom or Teams, and then everybody got exhausted. But I think as time wore on, we got better with flexibility. I'm not saying it was necessarily ideal, but we put it out there, and students have seen it, and they know that we're capable of doing it. Okay, so I think that's the environment we're now in, is rather than students building their lives around us as an institute. I mean, this has been part of the discourse for a long time, but I think it's just become very true because of the pandemic. So rather than students building their lives around us as institutions, there's a greater expectation that we as institutions will respond to what the students require in terms of flexibility, and a lot of that's to do with the digital. So what does that actually mean? Well, the really simple way of looking at it is, you know, you just record everything and make everything available. You just, anything that happens in a building, you record it. Anything that happens online, you record it, and you put it somewhere where the students can get to it. Yeah, I guess that's probably true. I think that's kind of a response to flexibility, which is based on kind of mirroring the traditional model, but just offering more access to the traditional model rather than fundamentally shifting the model. I mean, my view of higher education is just my view, is that you know, an undergraduate degree, a postgraduate degree, let's say that's the traditional offer, is a really big commitment, and it's quite a difficult thing to navigate. And so over the last 20 years or so, as institutions, we haven't necessarily changed that core of the offer, the mode of it, that much. But what we have done is built on more and more services to help students kind of survive or help them navigate that offer. So it's an interesting thing from an institutional point of view, because what we're essentially saying is the core thing we offer is really, really difficult. So we're going to offer tons and tons of support to help you navigate the really difficult thing. But we haven't really necessarily fundamentally changed the difficult thing. I'm not saying that learning should be easy, by the way. I think it should be challenging and all the rest of it. And then we've got these questions around, oh, one response to flexibility could be hybrid, you know, where you're trying to connect together the fact that learners want to be on, some learners want to be online, some learners want to be in the building, but actually they're the same cohort. Can you connect those worlds together? High flex. And my new one, hyperlearnatron. So, I mean, I know that everywhere is doing some version of high flex or hybrid. Hyperlearnatron is obviously nonsense. It's really just, you know, there are a lot of words, right? There are a lot of words, and I think that what you've got to ask is, what's the fundamental kind of underpinning principle here? Is it to kind of blend the online into the physical so that we're still sort of the same, but there's also online, or is it a fundamental shift in what we're offering and the way that we're doing it? I'm just going to read the text chat. Yes, absolutely. Well, Lynn, you've kind of preempted one of my slides, which is good. I think it shows that, you know, there's a good balance in here, because I'm about to talk about that in a bit, because I totally agree. The other thing is that this is anecdotal from me, and I think we'll get more and more actual information on it as we go. But when you listen to what people have missed about not being able to get into the buildings and what they hope from the buildings, is a lot of what they're talking about is social and cultural, but not necessarily directly to do with learning. So I think there's an interesting question, you know, beyond labs and specialist material practices and all of the rest of it like that. Perhaps our buildings are more about the cultural experience of education than the intellectual educational experience of education, if you like. And that I found that very useful in any discussion, is to start the discussion by saying, you know, higher education is a cultural experience and an educational experience, but not all students want or require both. Okay. Yeah, yeah. I think that point from Michael is huge as well, especially if we're going to reach out to new communities of students that perhaps haven't been in education for a long time. So how do we respond to some of the things I've just been talking about? I mean, it's a bit like, for me, it's a bit like location. Okay, it's design. I think we're now in a scenario where curriculum needs to be designed, and I separate that out from validated. So I think this is where learning designers are incredibly important. And so you've got the kind of internal learning design of the curriculum and the design of the curriculum itself, which, you know, validation processes don't go into that detail. So we need to leave open the space for that design process. The background on this slide is you know, I'm working with learning designers in my team, and they co-design with academics, and it's a really positive process if you are given the time to do it. Not only is it positive in pedagogic terms and curricular terms, but it also becomes a really great form of staff development. Everybody's learning in that process. Just coming back on Lynn's point, the real challenge, so I think my position is, I think pedagogically we know how to provide the flexibility, and we know how to respond to the new expectations that have been generated, quite rightly, by the pandemic. I'm not worried about that. You just need the time, and it needs to be invested in. So you have to make that choice to invest in it. The bit that's really hard is the systems and processes that run our institutions behind everything, and the fact that that's a giant machine that is geared to produce kind of an offer in a very particular way, and on every single point it's quite difficult to re-gear that, you know, recruitment, admissions, enrollment, academic, you know, the whole, you know, exams, exam boards, all of that is quite difficult to rewire. So I'm less worried about that the kind of core of the teaching and learning, as long as we invest. I'm more worried about everything else around it, including things that are to do with the student experience that aren't inside curriculum. I think that's a really tough area. Just having a look at the chat again, because there's some lovely things in there. Yes, I do. I think, Rocky, there is an opportunity to rethink how we scaffold students into the learning process. One of the things we've been thinking about is blurring the boundary between induction, support and curriculum, and trying to make them sort of all part of the same thing. It's a difficult thing to do. Learning how to learn is a legitimate thing to learn, right? And so again, that breaks down that model of there is curriculum and then all these things to support you through curriculum. Perhaps curriculum, it should be more integrally supportive. Easy to say, difficult to do. Last point here, and then I'll move on. Authenticity. This is important. One of the things that I think I came to realize over the pandemic is that in our institute, that within the psychology of our institutions, I can't speak for Lincoln, but I'm just talking broadly, there is a concept of the authentic bit of the institution and then other bits of the institution. And actually, largely, what's considered authentic is full awards, undergraduate, postgraduate, research, whatever it might be. And then everything else is built as a kind of in relation to that, or as something that pipes you into that. So the idea that you might come and do 20 credits of something and then walk away Is that authentic? Well, it is. To my mind, it is from a learning point of view, but within the sort of psychology of the sector, is it? I think there are kind of multiple authentics. I'll move on. So during the pandemic, I think this was late 2020. I made this sort of 7-minute long video, which was it was a provocation that just said, well, what does it mean to be an art school or a university that has little or no access to buildings, and just explored that. And I think here's some of the ways, I'm just going to go through very quickly some of the ways we responded to the pandemic, but it's not about the pandemic, actually. I'm trying to frame this as interesting modes of teaching and learning that have been, if you like, catalyzed by the pandemic. So one of the key things is assessment. I think this is huge, really. So I'm going to tell a very brief story that sort of gives some context. So what tends to happen within like kind of a capitalist realist environment, Mark Fisher stuff and all the rest of it, is that we focus on solutions for small areas rather than looking at things structurally. So I heard a story which was, it's just a sad story really in some ways, which was there was a problem with people who were sleeping on the streets being stabbed. So somebody invented a stab-proof sleeping bag, rather than perhaps as a society we should think about helping, homelessness as a principle, right? I think sometimes we're like that with assessment. So we have really quite brutal assessment practices, and then we create technology that kind of supports that brutality, rather than going, maybe we should redesign assessment. Okay, so what happened in the pandemic for us, these are our main assessment criteria. Well, they're the only assessment criteria we have across our university. We shifted from realization to process. So the focus became less on the final object and more on the narrative of how you approached potentially making something. You might make something, you might not make it. Now, for years, we claimed that that's what we did as an institution anyway. We were about the narrative of the evolution of your practice, rather than just making a nice thing and everybody going, isn't that lovely? In practice, I'm using this word in 15 different ways. In practice, the pandemic sort of forced us to do what we claim to do, and I think it was really strong from a learning perspective. A lot of our students figuring out how to survive your curriculum, and then it's just gone up the screen a little bit. I think that point from Mark about not having a deficit model is really useful as well. It's easy, again, it's easy to say, but it's also easy to slip into the habit of seeing students as deficit. Well, I guess it's a bit like the social model of disability, isn't it? Is that actually perhaps it's the environment and the structures that are the deficit and not the student. Okay, yeah, peer-to-peer, I think it's got tons and tons of potential. Well, it also happens in places. We're not super hot on that at my institution, actually. I think it's something we could look at more. So just a few other examples. I'm going to hammer through this really quickly so that we've got 15 minutes for Q&A, but it's great to see people chatting here. So some of the things that were great in terms of digital learning in the pandemic was this sudden emergence of what I think of as spatial collaboration platforms. Like, these were huge for us because they really, students at UAL, and I'd argue most people think spatially. So, it's a bit like mind maps. You kind of put concepts around a physical space, whether it's post-it notes or in notes, and draw arrows between them, and then you understand them. It's an epistemological thing, isn't it? You understand how they relate to each other, and that's where the understanding comes from. This is just a screenshot of a massive Miro board that ran pretty much a whole of a module at UAL. And there's lots of examples of our academic staff using these kind of online whiteboardy sort of everybody can move stuff around boards. I think that that's been really powerful because it's spatialized thinking. And, you know, also people were teaching illustration, and you could put images in and you know, annotate them. Really, really powerful, even to the point that now where we're working face to face, we've sort of ditched the physical post-it notes, of which I have plenty here, and we'll go into a room and look at a Miro board on all of our screens and have the same discussion, but at the end of it, we've actually got a thing that we can take away, and we don't have that poor person that has to roll up 2 kilograms of flip chart paper with post-it notes falling off it and try and make sense of it afterwards. Anyway, that's one example that I think was really powerful. And then, you know, physical practices, we found a lot of ways of doing these by, you know, either, and you'll have plenty of examples of this yourself, but I think it demonstrates that you can get to a learning outcome in lots of really interesting ways that don't have to involve necessarily massive amount of materials or lots of fancy equipment. There's a limit to that. But I think, you know, our courses were physically mailing little packs of stuff to people. That was great. Or using kind of household stuff like spaghetti for architecture here. I mean, I think they do this when they're together in the college as well, but it worked from home. It worked really well. And actually, it as I say, it encouraged students to really focus on the learning aspect rather than the thing aspect. And also, it flattened out what I think of it as flattening out the individual circumstances curve, which becomes really, really important. And we found that through the pandemic, that obviously different people, whether staff or students, were in very different contexts and perhaps had access to different spaces or different amount of materials, different technology, different quality of broadband. And so our curriculum had to, all of our advice to academic staff was around techniques to flatten out that individual circumstances curve. It's always been a problem for UAL is that there's this feeling that students that can afford loads of really expensive materials and have their own studio space get better marks. I don't think that's actually true, but obviously it creates a vibe. So I think going forwards, you know, design, a lot of it needs to be focused on flattening out the individual circumstances curve. And in terms of inclusion, that's massive. So there's one thing that genuinely vexes me, where there's a massive scrutiny on the quality and the potential inclusive or exclusive nature of online learning, and it's this, which is in the case of my institution, there is nothing more exclusive than having to move to London for 3 years to do your degree. But we tend to talk about inclusion around that community that have already decided to do that, rather than talk about the ones that couldn't get there, if you see what I mean. A little bit of politics there. Okay, so yeah, it is a very different mode. I'm just this is Christopher, I think. It is a very different mode of learning in higher education. It should be, and it takes a lot to figure out. And I think sometimes because we're not explicit about that, sometimes higher education becomes a kind of guess the mode or guess the culture, and that tends to favour a certain group of people who are already in a privileged position, I'd argue. So my response to that is we have to be explicit about what we're offering and what it means to engage with what we're offering. Quite often we're not explicit about that. We work on a kind of assumption that there's a shared cultural understanding of the process, if you like, and the experience, and I don't think there is. Not really, or at least the shared cultural understanding is often way out of date. Right, I've only got 3 minutes, so I'm going to do this very quickly. Really, just got a couple of last points, right? Here's my big pitch, and I like the way it says blank slide there. I was convinced that was going to disappear, but it's not a blank slide. It's a bit like in a textbook where it says this page left blank for your notes. And I'm like, well, it's not, is it? You've written that on it. And then anyway, this is how I get distracted. So my pitch, really, if you like, is that all courses are digital courses, some of which also have moments that take place in buildings. So if in principle you design all of your curriculum as digital, so you lead with digital in the design process, and then you look at the synchronous moments and you go, which of these need to take place in buildings or should take place in buildings? I think you end up with a really, really strong design for curriculum and the learning design within it. I'm not suggesting that that means that you do tons and tons and tons and tons of online learning. You can use that principle and actually spend more time in the building than you do online. Okay, it's not about amounts. It's not about a fight between the two modes. It's just essentially saying, rather than design residential and then kind of add digital in when residential stops working, you design essentially a fully online course and then bring the buildings into it. Just do it the other way up. And this is a not brilliant diagram I did at some point in the pandemic that kind of demonstrated that actually, you know, there are many moments where the teaching could be online or it could be in a building. And the point and the question was, well, which is more appropriate given what you're offering and given what you're teaching, rather than having an argument about which one's better. Last point. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. Belonging is inconvenient. Okay, it requires a lot of commitment. In our traditional residential model, students massively commit by moving city quite often and going to physical buildings, and hopefully there's a sense of belonging in that, but that's a huge commitment, and it's partly because they want that cultural experience of higher education. There are, as we know, and a lot of institutions already deal with this, a lot of students out there who don't need to belong, they just want to learn the thing. That is not terrible. That is not a bad thing. What maybe I'm seeing across the sector is that when we consider more digital learning and more online learning, we're kind of implicitly assuming that it's the same set of students that we normally deal with, they just happen to be online. I think it's a completely different set of people, potentially, okay, as well as the same set, but I think there's a lot of potential to engage with whole new communities of students who would otherwise not come to us, and they don't necessarily need to belong. I've got a little chart here that I'm not going to go into in any kind of detail. The point is to be clear about it. You know, yes, the matter point, Hazel, is really important, and I can't remember. Is it Peter something was mentioning that? I think that's a really useful way of looking at it. That's the blog post. I do reference the matter thing that somebody was writing about in the blog post. So some of our pedagogy requires community. I love that stuff. A lot of it doesn't. But we're sort of a bit obsessed with it at the moment because it's exactly what fell away during the pandemic. It didn't fall away because we went online. It fell away because of the way we went online. So in the end, last point, and then I'm only 1 minute over. Oh, that was the bell. Okay, I think I'm not actually convinced about this, and it also says blank slide on this one, which is nice. There's all this sense of flexible, stackable offers. We don't really know to what extent people want that. I think what I'd say is that we do need to be thinking about how we can build the offer around different student communities rather than require, as I say, students to kind of rewire their whole lives to fit in with us. And the pandemic might have been the tipping point on that. I think the important point for me that I'll come back to is design. Is we need to invest in the time and space to go through those learning design and curriculum design processes, to allow us those learning design and curriculum design processes, to allow us to create curriculum, whether it's digital or residential, that allows the most students to be successful in ways that are meaningful to them, which is perhaps what mattering means, you know. And so my hope is that our institutions will invest in that and open up that space. At the moment, within the academic cycle of any given year, there's not really any space for that design process unless you really deliberately open it up. And I think that that's what's really important. And we've got the methods to do it if we have the space to do it. Anyway, I'll stop because I'm slightly over time and I did hear the bell.
No. I'm happy to let you overrun because you were answering some of the questions that were coming up during the chat. So
that's true, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think all you've done is reclaim the time that you had.
Look at that.
So you haven't run over. But thank you. I think you've engaged and raised a lot of interesting points there. And I have an initial comment, but it's more of a comment than a statement. But I mean, the idea of start with the digital and add the buildings in, really interesting. Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. But there might be an argument that we would say that, wouldn't we?
Yes,
you know,
because
that's our role, and particularly against the political backdrop where the idea of the primacy of the face-to-face experience being the only true learning experience, and then particularly the political messages that comes from Parliament in terms of and the reasons why they would say that. All gets added into the mix, whether that's a valid statement or not. I mean, any thoughts around that area? I know it's probably
no, absolutely. I think you're right to mention it. This is a highly political area. I mean, higher education always is. I think what's happened is the pandemic has put online digital teaching and learning into the mainstream, and therefore it's become part of the politics all of a sudden. Whereas I think pre-pandemic, to a certain extent, it was seen as, well, that's sort of not the real university, so we don't need to think about it. Even at institutions where a massive amount of work and revenue came from online, it's like we've finally had to admit to ourselves as a sector that we are fundamentally extremely digital. It fascinated me at the start of the pandemic that everything didn't immediately fall over and break. And I think one of the reasons was because we were already really digital. We just hadn't admitted it to ourselves. Now, in terms of the authenticity question, I think what we're seeing is this like tide fight between the sort of romanticized cultural conception of what higher education should be as a cultural experience, and that, you know, there are completely legitimate aspects of the cultural experience of higher education, of course, but I think politically that cultural experience is being framed in an extremely narrow kind of Russell groupy, what I remember when I went to university way. There's a fight between that and what it means to provide really effective, engaging, and if you like, I don't know, liberating teaching and learning for our students so that they can become and belong and become the people that they want to be. And in many places, their intention. So I think we've got to be confident as institutions and sort of and say, you know what, actually there are aspects to online and digital that are fundamentally, like, ideologically and ethically sound. You know, we know that online really serves certain student communities really, really well, often better than face-to-face. So what I see happening is you know, the sector's going to lose confidence. It's going to say, no, everybody back to college. A large portion of the student body is going to go, what? I don't like that. I want this flexibility. I want choices. So we're going to get, you know, we're caught between a rock and a hard place on that. But you know, I think it's a time where the sector needs to sort of confidently respond to political pressure, which is not easy to do.
I think there is a chance of an overcorrection, and you know, hopefully we will learn and pull back to that. What is the optimal balance rather than just completely reject it all? But here we have a few questions come through. I think Michael's first one. Do we need to consider offering a range of assessments per module to support both digital and residential learners?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. I'm not entirely sure, because you know, a range is good, but who's going to do that? I mean, that's a lot of work, right? Uh, I I wonder whether it's about, so you know, this again, I'm just in the middle of this thought. I wonder if it's about disaggregating assessment and learning a little bit more in some ways, so that you can engage with what we have to offer and choose not to take the accredited and assessed route, but you're learning the same thing, or choose to take the assessed route. Now that's fraught with all kinds of difficulties, but I feel like there's something in that. In terms of modes of assessment, I'm not an expert in that area, but I'd argue, you know, less is more with assessment. So I think my response to that is actually more formative feedback and less summative assessment in design terms, because that puts less pressure on the students and less pressure on staff as well in some ways, and it's more constructive, and it's just better scaffolding. So to shift the emphasis away from the summative to the formative, again, not an easy thing to do. We had really interesting stuff happened in the pandemic, because we said, hey, if you're in I think it was first year modules, we're going to make them all pass fail so that you can just focus on your learning. You don't have to stress about assessment. At which point I immediately said, so why didn't we do that before? And then secondly, quite a lot of our students fed back, well, I'm happy with pass fail, but I also want to know exactly how well I'm doing. So there's some interesting tensions. One of the things that I find really fascinating is that often student body wants to be ranked, and I think sometimes we forget that we are ranking institutions. So there's tensions to be negotiated in there, but as I say, I'd go for, you know, rather than multiple modes, more formative, less summative.
Yeah, thank you. Forgive me to those putting comments in the chat if I've interpreted your statement as a comment rather than a question. Please do raise your hand and ask it. But Mark's raised a question here. Given the structure of UAL, i.e. multiple independent colleges, to what degree have you allowed digital independence in direction and approach, and where have you drawn the line and required institutional universality?
Oh, is that the door?
Yeah.
It's I think yeah. So what we did, because we are quite a diffused institution, and we're not really particularly top down in terms of teaching practice. So what we immediately did was we developed very quickly and promoted what we called core practice, where we said, just do these things in a tidy way and it will be fine. And the core practice was things like just use sort of a minimum amount of platforms, but do it really well. You know, make sure your structures are tidy in the VLE, just basic good practice. And sort of keep it simple, but keep it tidy. A lot of colleagues immediately went out and said, well, I want to use this and this and this because they're the easiest and they're the best. And then they ended up with a course that had like 17 different platforms, and every time somebody got taught, it would be in a different platform that kind of did the same thing and all of the rest of it. And so I think the net result was our core practice advice looked a bit dull, but it created a really, really sustainable situation, because we were about sustainability and kind of staff time and people not burning out. So we were saying, this is the way to do it if you don't want to burn out. I think what happened over the pandemic is that a lot of staff then did operate really unilaterally. I mean, sometimes they had specialist reasons to do that, but often they would create an environment that was really rich and complex, but really hard to sustain. And then after about a year of that, I think people started to see sort of come back towards our advice, because the easiest thing to do with digital is to do something that's fabulous but utterly exhausting and unsustainable. So I think what happened was there was a bit of an evolution where people sort of found out the hard way And with that kind of institution, you know, people learn by doing, and so everybody went out and learned by doing, and then sort of came back round to a certain extent. But we're reasonably generous. We don't lock things down. We don't police stuff really tightly, but we do try and provide advice and support that will stop people becoming totally exhausted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, is there any other questions anyone wants to ask from the group? Whilst we've still got a minute left. Whilst everyone's considering that, just reflecting on the face-to-face experience and the digital experience, and that this experience we've just been through in the last 40 minutes is a really good indication of how this experience can be different, but as good, if not better, than a lecture experience, because of the rich discussion we've had in the chat, the inclusivity of that. Everyone's been able to engage with that, and we've been able to engage directly with you, which is something you can't do in a face-to-face.
No, I mean, it's my favorite thing about this mode is the fact that the text chat can carry on whilst I'm talking, and it makes it a bit less transmissive, but it also like makes me feel more confident that you're out there thinking about it, if you know what I mean. So it's great to see these comments come in. It's enormously encouraging for me. I was just going to respond to Robert and flexibility. I think flexibility is the new giant bucket word that could mean a million different things to a million different people. And actually, we've got a job to do, which is to kind of pick apart what we mean by flexible. There are so many different potential dimensions of flexible, and often I think the danger is that we'll be flexible at our convenience rather than flexible at the convenience of the student community. So I think to define flexible, you also have to define the circumstances of the students you think you're being flexible for. And flexibility can come in curricular forms, you know, short chunks, stackable, pick and mix, or it can be within the teaching in terms of, yeah, everything's synchronous, but you can also see recordings, or everything's asynchronous because that's super flexible. Or another version of flexible would be everything has to work on a mobile phone, so it's flexible in terms of modes of access and, you know, how socioeconomic forms of access as well. So just to finish, I think that's a useful place to finish, actually, is that flexibility, like I say, over the pandemic, as an emergency response, we accidentally became more flexible in some ways, but there are many more dimensions of it that we need to consider and kind of agree on. Otherwise, what will happen is anything that we offer as flexible, everybody will be slightly disappointed in for different reasons because they've all assumed a different concept of flexibility. So yeah, I think flexible facilitating inclusivity, it's clearly got to be top of the list. But yeah, then there are all sorts of other versions of it, aren't there? I'll stop there because we're at time. But that's a good place to stop, I think.